On a frozen night in Montana, a broke veteran came home believing his life was already over. No family, no future, just cold and silence. Then he heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind. At his door stood a German shepherd, shielding a 6-week-old puppy, shaking, ready to die. He had no money, no strength left, only one choice. What he did next didn't just save 2 lives, it revealed how God still works through ordinary people, quiet courage, and open doors. Stay with this story, and don't forget to subscribe for more true miracles like this. Snow came down sideways across the Montana foothills, thick and relentless, turning the night into a moving wall of white and erasing the line between road, sky, and ground. Mike Carter killed the engine of his rusted pickup and sat still for a moment, his hands resting on the cracked steering wheel as the heater coughed out one last breath of lukewarm air. 46 years old, broad-shouldered but worn thin by time and labor, Mike looked older than he was when the light hit his face just right. His hair, once dark, had gone prematurely gray at the temples, cropped short not for style but convenience. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, uneven and untrimmed, the kind a man grows when mirrors stop mattering. His face was angular, weathered, with a crooked scar near his eyebrow, an old souvenir from a place he no longer named aloud. His eyes were steel blue and tired, the eyes of someone who had learned to scan rooms instinctively, even when there was no enemy left to find. Mike lived in a trailer that sat just beyond the edge of town, parked on a patch of frozen dirt bordered by scrub pines and an abandoned fence that leaned like it had given up years ago. It wasn't much, but it was cheap, and cheap was what he could afford on a road maintenance worker's wages. 12-hour shifts, overnight repairs, snow clearing, asphalt patching in summer, work that broke your body slowly and paid just enough to keep you coming back. He stepped out into the storm, boots crunching against ice, his shoulders hunched instinctively against the cold. The wind cut through his jacket like it had teeth. Inside the trailer, the air smelled faintly of oil, damp metal, and instant coffee. The place was narrow and dim, lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered when the wind rattled the power lines. A small table, one chair, a narrow cot pushed against the wall, and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. On the counter sat an unopened can of soup and half a loaf of bread. Tonight's dinner, tomorrow's breakfast. Mike kicked the door shut behind him and leaned his forehead against it for a second, breathing slowly. Nights were the hardest. Not because of the cold, but because silence had a way of getting loud when there was nothing left to distract him. He had learned in the service how to endure noise, gunfire, rotors, shouted commands, but quiet was different. Quiet gave memory room to move. He reached for the lock. That was when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind shifting debris against the steps. The storm was loud enough to make anything sound alive. Then it came again, soft, uneven, deliberate, a faint scratching, followed by something that might have been a whimper, or might have been his imagination filling in blanks it shouldn't. Mike froze. His pulse picked up, not from fear, but from habit. He stood still, listening. The sound came again, closer now, unmistakable. Something was at the door. No, he muttered under his breath, more plea than word. Out here, things didn't come looking for you unless they were desperate. He unlocked the door anyway. Cold air exploded inside, snow swirling across the floor. For a second, he saw nothing but white. Then shapes emerged from the storm. A German shepherd stood on his steps, large and solid despite the wind, its thick black and tan coat dusted with snow. The dog's stance was wide and braced, paws planted like it had decided this was as far as it would let the storm push it. Its ears were half back, not in fear but alertness, and its dark eyes never left Mike's face. There was no barking, no growling, just a steady, unwavering stare that felt uncomfortably intentional. Behind the big dog, something small shifted. A puppy. No more than 6 weeks old, its legs trembling as it tried to stay upright. Its fur was clumped with ice, the soft tan beneath barely visible. It took one step forward and collapsed, its body giving in to exhaustion. Mike's chest tightened. He'd seen collapse before, men going down from heat, from blood loss, from sheer shock, but seeing it happen to something that small felt different. The big dog moved instantly, positioning itself between the puppy and the wind, lowering its body to shield it. "Damn it," Mike whispered. The sensible part of him said to close the door. He had barely enough to keep himself going. No money for vet bills, no space, no margin for problems. This was how you fell further behind. This was how you lost what little control you still had. The German shepherd didn't move. It just watched him, eyes steady, almost accusing. Mike exhaled sharply and stepped forward. The puppy tried to lift its head and failed. That decided it. "All right," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "All right, come on." He scooped the puppy up first. It was terrifyingly light, its body cold through his gloves. He tucked it against his chest, then motioned for the bigger dog. "You too, before I change my mind." The shepherd hesitated only a second before stepping inside. Mike shut the door and locked it. The sound final in a way that made his stomach twist. Snow melted off fur and boots, leaving dark patches on the floor. He laid the puppy down on his jacket near the heater and rubbed it gently with a towel. The puppy let out a weak sound and curled into itself. The big dog stayed close, watching every movement, muscles tense but controlled. Up close, Mike could see scars beneath the fur. Old ones, faint but telling. This dog had been around people long enough to learn caution. "You got a name?" Mike asked, not expecting an answer. The dog didn't react, just sat, tail low, body angled protectively toward the puppy. Mike opened the can of soup and warmed it on the stove, thinning it with water until it was safe. He poured a little into a shallow dish and nudged it toward the puppy. The puppy sniffed, then drank weakly. The big dog waited, only lowering its head once the puppy finished. "Yeah," Mike murmured, "you're the type that waits." He wrapped both dogs in his jacket and watched their breathing slow. The room felt different now. Smaller, warmer, occupied. The silence had weight again, but not the crushing kind. Mike sat back in the chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. He thought about the last time he'd felt responsible for someone else. How it had ended. How he'd promised himself never again. The puppy shifted in its sleep, pressing closer to his leg. The big dog leaned against the heater, eyes half-lidded but alert. Mike closed his eyes. For the first time in years, sleep came without a fight, carrying with it a single unfamiliar thought that lingered as he drifted off. Maybe being needed was its own kind of shelter. Morning crept in quietly after the storm, not with sunlight but with a dull gray that pressed against the trailer windows like a held breath. Mike Carter woke on the chair where he'd fallen asleep, his back stiff, his boots still on. For a moment he didn't remember why the room felt different. Then he felt the weight at his feet. The puppy, Buddy, was curled against the heater, breathing shallowly, while the larger German shepherd, Ranger, sat upright beside him, ears angled toward the door, unmoving, vigilant. Mike rubbed his face with both hands and exhaled. This was real. This hadn't been a dream that faded with daylight. The first problem arrived with the morning cold. The heater coughed and died, leaving the trailer to cool fast. Mike wrapped Buddy tighter in his jacket and nudged the thermostat again, coaxing it back to life. Ranger shifted closer, placing his body between the puppy and the draft that slipped in through the cracked door frame. There was an intelligence to the dog's movements that unsettled Mike. Not trained obedience exactly, but judgment. Ranger seemed to understand priorities. Mike glanced at the clock. He had an early shift. Missing work wasn't an option. He fed the dogs what little was left, watered down to stretch it, then stood there staring at them like a man looking at a locked door he had no key for. The landlord had made it clear when Mike signed the lease. No pets, no exceptions. Mike had nodded then because nodding was easier than arguing when you needed a roof. He left Ranger inside with Buddy and drove to work with his jaw clenched, the road slick and narrow. All day, he patched asphalt with numb hands, his thoughts circling back to the trailer. When his phone buzzed during break, it wasn't a call, just a notice from the power company warning of an overdue bill. He deleted it without reading the rest. That night, the hiding began. Ranger learned quickly. At every unfamiliar sound, he guided Buddy under the cot, blocking him from view. When headlights swept past the window, Ranger froze, eyes locked on the door. Mike watched this in silence, something heavy forming behind his ribs. He'd spent years pretending he didn't recognize that kind of watchfulness. Money disappeared faster than Mike expected. He skipped meals, drank coffee to kill hunger, and spent his last spare cash on puppy formula from the feed store instead of groceries. Buddy's appetite was weak, his body too warm, his breathing uneven. Mike checked his forehead like he'd seen parents do, the heat alarming. He sat on the floor beside the heater, Buddy in his lap, Ranger pressed against his side. "You gotta stay with me," Mike whispered, unsure who he was talking to, Buddy himself, or something else entirely. By the third night, Buddy's breathing worsened. He trembled, even when the heater worked. Mike tried to convince himself it would pass, that warmth and rest were enough. That was the lie he told himself until Buddy let out a small, strained sound that made Mike's chest tighten hard enough to hurt. He reached for the old radio sitting on the shelf, the one he barely used because silence felt safer. He hesitated, thumb hovering, pride rising up like a wall. Then Buddy coughed weakly. Ranger whined low in his throat, not panic, but urgency. "All right," Mike said aloud. "All right." Grace Miller arrived less than an hour later, her headlights cutting through the dark like a promise. She was in her early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair pulled back into a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. Her face was lined in a way that spoke of long winters and longer nights, but her gray eyes were steady and observant, missing very little. She wore a thick wool coat and practical boots, the kind of woman who dressed for function, not display. She stepped into the trailer without judgment, setting her bag down and kneeling immediately beside Buddy. Ranger watched her closely, body tense but still. Grace noticed and moved slowly, speaking softly as she examined the puppy with practiced hands. "He's burning up," she said calmly. "You did right calling." Mike swallowed. "I didn't know who else to—" Grace held up a hand. "You called. That's what matters." She worked efficiently, cleaning, checking, administering medicine with the ease of someone who had done this before many times. She didn't ask where the dogs came from or why Mike had them. When she finally looked up at him, her gaze was direct but kind. "Some people survive things that break others," she said. "That doesn't mean they're meant to live small afterward." Mike didn't answer. He stared at Buddy as the puppy's breathing slowly evened out. Ranger settled at Grace's side, tension easing just enough to show trust. Grace packed up quietly, leaving behind medicine and instructions. At the door, she paused. "You don't have to do this alone," she said simply, then stepped back into the night. Mike closed the door and leaned against it, eyes burning. Ranger came to sit beside him, solid and warm. Buddy slept. For the first time since the war, Mike understood something he hadn't wanted to admit. If he walked away now, if he chose comfort over responsibility, he wouldn't just lose them. He'd lose whatever part of himself had survived. And there would be no way back. Mike woke to the wrong kind of silence. It wasn't the calm, shallow quiet that came after a long night, but an absence sharp enough to jolt him fully awake. The heater hummed. The trailer creaked. Ranger sat near the door, tense, ears forward, tail stiff. The space beside the cot was empty. Buddy was gone. Mike's chest tightened instantly. He swung his legs down, calling Buddy's name once, then again, louder, already knowing the answer. Ranger didn't wait for a command. The big German shepherd moved to the door, pawing at it, whining low in his throat, eyes locked on Mike with an urgency that needed no translation. "Okay," Mike said, already pulling on his boots. "Okay, I'm coming." The door burst open into pale morning light. Overnight snowfall had softened into a thin white layer, delicate enough to hold tracks. Small, uneven paw prints led away from the trailer toward the tree line. Mike swallowed hard. Buddy had wandered off before dawn. Alone. Ranger took the lead immediately, nose low, body cutting a straight line through the cold air. Mike followed, breath fogging, boots sinking into the snow with every step. The forest swallowed them quickly. Pines stood tall and indifferent, their branches heavy with frost. The world was quiet in that way that made every sound feel too loud. Breathing, crunching snow, the pounding of Mike's heart. "Buddy," Mike called, forcing his voice steady. "Come on, boy." The sound vanished into the trees. As they moved deeper, the ground grew uneven. Old markers, rusted wire, half-buried stakes jutted from the snow, remnants of traps set years ago and forgotten. Mike noticed them too late. Ranger stopped abruptly, barking once, sharp and urgent. He stood rigid, staring at a low mound near a fallen log. Mike ran. Buddy lay half-buried in the snow, his small body shaking violently. A thin wire snare was cinched tight around his hind leg, cutting through fur and into flesh. Blood darkened the snow beneath him, already freezing at the edges. The puppy whimpered weakly, eyes glassy, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, dropping to his knees. His hands hovered uselessly for a second, the world narrowing to the sight of that wire, that blood, that helplessness. Ranger stood over Buddy, blocking the wind, growling low, not at Mike, but at the situation itself, as if daring it to take one more inch. Mike forced himself to breathe. Assess. Act. Protect. The old training snapped back into place whether he wanted it or not. He tore off his gloves, ignoring the bite of cold, and reached for the snare. The wire was old but stubborn, twisted tight. His fingers shook, not from the temperature but from memory. Another place, another morning, another body he couldn't free fast enough. "Easy, Buddy," Mike whispered, his voice breaking despite himself. "I've got you." He fumbled for the small pair of pliers clipped to his belt, tools he carried out of habit more than necessity. Ranger leaned in closer, pressing his shoulder against Buddy's side, steadying him. The puppy cried once when the wire shifted, then went still, exhausted. Mike's vision blurred. He blinked hard and focused, cutting through the wire with a sharp snap. The tension released instantly. Buddy went limp against the snow. Panic surged. Mike scooped him up, pressing the puppy's small body against his chest, wrapping his jacket around him. Blood soaked into the fabric. Ranger paced tight circles, whining, then fell into step beside Mike as he turned back toward the trailer, running now, lungs burning, legs screaming with every step. By the time they reached the trailer, Buddy's breathing was shallow and uneven. Mike kicked the door shut behind them and laid the puppy near the heater, hands moving fast but clumsy. Pressure on the wound. Warmth. Keep him awake. His radio slipped from his pocket and clattered to the floor. Mike stared at it for half a second, then grabbed it with shaking fingers. "Grace," he said into the static. "Grace, I need help. Please." The wait felt endless. Mike sat on the floor, Buddy cradled in his arms, Ranger pressed against his back like a brace holding him upright. When headlights finally cut through the window, Mike let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Grace Miller came in briskly, her silver braid tucked into her coat, her expression focused and calm. She took one look at Buddy and moved instantly, kneeling beside him. "How long?" she asked. 10 minutes, maybe less," Mike said, his voice raw. "Good," she replied, already working. "That helps." She cleaned the wound carefully, her hands steady, efficient. Buddy whimpered faintly, then quieted. Ranger watched every movement, his body tense but trusting. Grace wrapped a leg, firm but gentle, then sat back slightly. "He's alive," she said, "but you need to watch him closely. Infection is the danger now." She met Mike's eyes. "If it sets in, he won't make it." Mike nodded, unable to speak. That night stretched long and thin. Mike didn't sleep. He sat on the floor with Buddy resting against his chest, feeling every shallow breath, every tiny movement. Ranger lay beside them, head up, eyes never closing. The heater hummed softly, fighting the cold. Memory crept in when exhaustion softened his defenses. Faces, names, the weight of a body he'd once carried that never breathed again. Mike's hands trembled, gripping Buddy a little tighter. "I won't," he whispered into the quiet. "I won't lose you." Buddy shifted, letting out a small sigh. Alive. Ranger pressed closer, solid and warm. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering the trap, the blood, the path they'd taken. Inside, Mike stayed awake, guarding the fragile life in his arms, understanding fully now that this was no accident, no temporary kindness. This was a line he couldn't uncross. And he didn't want to. The second storm arrived without ceremony, rolling over the foothills like a dark thought returning after you believed it had finally passed. Mike Carter knew it before the radio went dead. The air changed first, pressure dropping, wind sharpening. Then the lights flickered once and vanished. The heater fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Ranger rose to his feet, alert, ears pricked, while Buddy shifted on his blanket, his bandaged leg tucked close to his body, eyes dull with fatigue but still searching for Mike's face. Mike stood at the narrow window and watched snow begin to move sideways again, thickening fast, swallowing the distance between trees and road until the world narrowed to the length of his breath. Grace lived alone down in the low bend of the valley, in a small house that had seen better winters, and the thought of her out there with no power tightened something in Mike's chest. He tried the radio once, nothing but static, then again, slower, like patience might coax it back to life. Nothing. He looked down at Buddy, at the way the puppy's ribs lifted under the blanket, at Ranger's steady posture. "I know," he said quietly, as if answering a question no one had asked. "I know it's a bad idea." He pulled on his coat and wrapped a scarf around his neck, the fabric rough against his skin, and when he opened the door, the wind hit him hard enough to steal his breath. Ranger moved first, stepping into the storm with practiced confidence, then circling back to nudge Buddy forward. The puppy hesitated, favoring his leg, then pushed on anyway, stubborn as a spark. They hadn't gone far when Ranger stopped, barking once, sharp, urgent. Mike squinted through the whiteout and saw a shape half buried near the ditch, a man sprawled awkwardly, one arm bent beneath him, boots iced over. The man was older than Mike, maybe late 50s, with a beard gone gray and patchy, his coat thin and torn at the shoulder. His face was windburned and slack with cold, lips blue, eyes unfocused. Ranger circled him, barking again, while Buddy crawled forward and pressed his nose against the man's glove, then whined softly, a sound so small it cut through the wind. Mike dropped to a knee and shook the man gently. "Hey, stay with me." The man groaned, barely. That was enough. Mike hauled him up with a grunt, draping the man's arm over his shoulder, feeling the dead weight and the danger in every step. He couldn't carry him far, not in this wind, not with Buddy hurt, but he remembered the old tool shed by the tree line. A place with 3 walls still standing and a door that almost closed. They reached it by feel more than sight. Inside, Mike struck a flame with numb fingers and fed it splintered wood from a crate until a small fire took, its warmth immediate and precious. He stripped the man's wet coat, wrapped him in Mike's spare layer, and watched color return inch by inch. Ranger lay across the doorway like a living barricade, while Buddy pressed close to the man's side, his small body radiating heat. The man coughed, a wet sound, and mumbled a name. No one Mike recognized, but he was breathing, and that would have to be enough for now. Mike didn't stay. He couldn't. Grace was still out there. He left the man with water, instructions written on the back of a receipt in block letters, and a promise he spoke aloud, though no one asked for it. "I'll send help." The walk to Grace's place felt longer than the distance deserved. The storm climbed the hill with him, wind clawing at his coat, snow filling his boots. When he reached her porch, the roof line was wrong. One edge peeled back, shingles gone, the structure exposed to the teeth of the wind. He pounded on the door. "Grace!" The door opened a crack and she stood there wrapped in a quilt, silver hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale but steady, eyes sharp despite the cold. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, not unkindly, and stepped aside. Inside, the house was colder than the trailer, the stove dead, the windows rattling. Mike set to work without asking permission. He hauled a ladder from the shed, his hands burning as he climbed, Ranger bracing the base, Buddy sitting beneath the eaves like a sentry with a limp. Mike tore loose what the wind had already claimed and lashed a tarp over the wound with rope and nails, his body moving on instinct, the storm screaming inches from his face. When he came down, soaked and shaking, Grace pressed a mug into his hands. "Sit," she ordered, the nurse in her voice taking over, and he obeyed. They waited out the worst of it together, the house groaning, the fire coaxed back to life with careful patience. Grace watched Mike from her chair, the lines of her face softening. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. Mike stared into the flame. "Yeah," he said, "I did." When the wind eased near dawn, he rose to leave. He checked the road once, then twice, then headed back the way he'd come, Ranger at his side, Buddy hobbling but determined. The shed was still standing. The man was awake now, eyes clearer, gratitude rough and unpolished in his voice. Mike called it in when the radio crackled back to life, waited until headlights cut through the snow, then finally turned home. By the time he shut the trailer door behind him, exhaustion settled like a blanket. Buddy curled against his leg, Ranger stretched out along the wall, and Mike sank into the chair, feeling the storm recede. He thought of the man in the shed, of Grace under her mended roof, of the way his feet had carried him forward when every sensible voice had told him to stay put. In the quiet that followed, he understood something simple and heavy. He wasn't running from the past anymore. He was walking into the present, one risk at a time, because someone had to. Spring arrived quietly, not as a declaration but as a series of small permissions. The snow receded from the edges of the road, the air softened, and the mornings carried a thin, hopeful warmth that lingered just long enough to be noticed. Mike Carter felt it first in his hands. The stiffness that had lived in his fingers through winter loosened, and the ache in his shoulders dulled to something manageable. Buddy felt it too. The puppy's limp faded day by day, his leg growing stronger as he learned again how to run without fear. Ranger watched all of it with the patience of a seasoned guardian, correcting gently, standing between Buddy and danger, teaching by presence more than command. Mike kept his routine. He still rose before dawn for work, still pulled on the same worn jacket, still counted every dollar. Poverty didn't disappear with the snow, but purpose had settled in where dread once lived. Each evening he returned to the trailer to two sets of eyes waiting, one steady and watchful, the other bright and eager, and the waiting changed him. Ranger had become Buddy's quiet instructor, demonstrating when to sit, when to listen, when to stop. Buddy learned fast, absorbing Ranger's calm like heat from a stove, and when he stumbled, Ranger stood close, never impatient, never harsh. It was Grace Miller who first spoke the idea out loud. She stood on the patch of land behind Mike's trailer one afternoon, hands on her hips, silver hair tucked beneath a knit cap, surveying the open space where snowmelt pooled and dried in the sun. "You've got room," she said, more observation than suggestion. "Not much, but enough." Grace had a way of talking that made things feel possible without pretending they were easy. Years of nursing had shaped her voice, steady, precise, unafraid of hard truths. She'd begun stopping by most days now, checking Buddy's leg, bringing soup or bread, and reminding Mike to eat. The next addition came with laughter. Emily Parker arrived in a dented station wagon one Saturday morning, trailed by a handful of children bundled in mismatched jackets. Emily was in her late 30s, tall and slender with a soft, athletic posture that hinted at long walks and patience rather than force. Her hair was a warm chestnut brown, usually pulled into a loose ponytail that slipped free around her face, and her skin carried the pale freckles of someone more familiar with books and classrooms than sun. Her eyes were gentle but observant, the kind that noticed who stayed quiet at the back of a room. She taught at the local elementary school and had heard about Mike through Grace. Not the rumors, but the truth shaped by action. "We brought donations," Emily said, smiling in a way that put people at ease without pressing them. The kids wanted to help. The children unloaded bags of dog food, old blankets, a roll of wire fencing, and a stack of handwritten cards with crooked letters and drawings of dogs with oversized ears. Buddy bounded toward them, tail a blur, earning squeals and laughter. Ranger stood back, assessing, then relaxed when he saw no threat. What started as a pile of supplies became a project. Mike hammered posts into the thawing ground after work, his hands steady, his mind focused. Grace coordinated quietly, calling neighbors, arranging pickups, persuading without pressure. Emily returned with her students on weekends, teaching them how to carry water without spilling, how to move slowly so animals wouldn't spook, how kindness worked best when it was calm. The children listened. Ranger supervised with solemn authority. Buddy supervised with enthusiasm and mistakes. They called it Hopeyard, not because anyone was sentimental, but because the name fit. It wasn't a shelter with rules and forms. It was a place where abandoned dogs could rest, where workers stopped by after shifts to drink coffee and talk without having to explain themselves, where cots and laughter shared the same air. Mike built 3 simple pens and a covered area with straw bedding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Mike stayed poor. His truck still rattled. His paycheck still disappeared into bills. But he stood taller. He found himself teaching without realizing he was doing it, showing a laid-off mechanic how to read a dog's body language, explaining to a younger veteran why Ranger never flinched at sudden noise and why that mattered. Ranger took the lead naturally, demonstrating calm control, while Buddy offered joy in motion, reminding everyone that healing could look like play. One evening, as the light faded and the yard settled into quiet, Mike sat on the trailer steps with Grace. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. "I used to think I didn't deserve a place," Mike said, not looking at her. Grace didn't rush to answer. "Most people who think that," she said finally, "are the ones who've earned it the most." The final night came gently. Snow returned, light and clean, falling in slow flakes that softened sound. Mike had just finished locking the gate when he heard it, the familiar, tentative scratch at the door. He paused, heart lifting with recognition rather than fear. Ranger rose and moved beside him. Buddy followed, quieter now, older, steady. Outside stood a dog, thin and wary, coat matted from travel, eyes searching. Not a miracle, not a sign, just another life at the end of its strength. Mike opened the door and knelt, his smile unforced. "Come on," he said softly. "There's room." The dog stepped inside, the warmth taking hold. Ranger circled once and lay down. Buddy pressed close. The fire hummed. Mike stood and watched the quiet scene form itself, understanding at last what had been building all along. He hadn't saved the world. He hadn't erased the past. He had opened a door, again and again, and that had been enough. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive like thunder from the sky. Loud, undeniable, impossible to ignore. But the truth this story reminds us of is quieter and far more powerful. God often does not change the world in one great moment. He changes it through open doors, through tired hands that still choose to help, through hearts that decide to love again, even after being broken. Mike did not save the world. He saved one life, then another, and in doing so, God restored something in him too. That is how miracles usually work, not as spectacle, but as obedience to compassion. In our daily lives, we may feel small, exhausted, or unimportant. But if someone knocks, someone in need, someone hurting, someone forgotten, and we choose to answer with kindness, we become part of God's quiet work in this world. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to open the door. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what this story meant to you. And subscribe to the channel for more true stories of faith, redemption, and the small miracles that still walk among us. May God bless you, protect your home, and keep your heart warm. even through the longest winters of your life.